Good morning, and thanks for joining us today with International Student Loan. Today we're going to be talking about exchange rates. And if you're an international student, exchange rates make a huge impact on whether or not your dollar is going to go far. So that's why we decided that today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how exchange rates work, and then we're going to talk about tips on things that you can do to make sure that you get the most bang for your buck. So my name is Jennifer Frankel. I'm the Director of Financial Services here at International Student Loan. And I encourage you to send all of your questions to us throughout this presentation. So in the bottom corner of your screen, you'll have a Q&A. Please type them in. If you want, you can also send your questions by Facebook or by Twitter. We'll be standing by throughout the day to make sure we get all of your questions answered when it comes to exchange rates. So with that, let's get started. And so the first thing, if you're going to know about exchange rates, you have to know what it is. And if you're already an international student, you probably are already familiar with what it is, but if you're not, basically an exchange rate is the relative value between two currencies. So let's say that I'm a Canadian student, I'm going to study in the US. Here's a good chart that demonstrates that. You can see that you have US dollars and then Canadian dollars, and it's the relative value. So if I'm a Canadian student, I want to make sure that I do that exchange at the time that my Canadian dollar is worth more. That number is constantly changing. So depending on when you're doing that transaction and depending on your currency, that amount is going to shift around. So it's really important that you keep mind of that you stay aware of that, so that way you make sure that your money goes the farthest it can. But with that, it's really important to know what kinds of exchange rates exist out there. First of all, you have free floating exchange rates, and that's what I'm talking about back on that graph. It is the relative value, so it's fluctuating based on market forces. And what I mean by market forces is you have demand. So the amount of people, companies, and organizations that want, let's say, US dollars, that's going to increase the value of US dollars comparative to your home currency. So it's really important to make sure in those situations that you know not only what your currency is relative to your host country currency, but that you're aware of how those actually fluctuate. Secondly, we have pegged or fixed currency exchange rates. And so what that means is that it's either going to be a certain amount for that currency or that it actually does vary, but within a certain narrow range. When you're talking about pegged or pegged currencies, you're going to notice that it doesn't vary too much, so you won't have to worry too much about that. A good example of that was with China. China had its currency pegged to the US dollar, and so there was not a whole lot of variation between it. It actually stayed consistently the same no matter what time you were deciding to make that transaction into US dollars. So it's especially important if you are in a currency which is constantly fluctuating, that you are aware of what happens. A good way, if you're a math person like me and you want to know how that works, the best way to really think about it is in this equation. So you have your home country currency, whatever that is, and if you are, in my example, a Canadian student, for example, it's your Canadian currency, times the exchange rate, which is usually expressed as a percentage. And then it's minus a fee. And now the fee part is actually optional. It depends on how you're making that transaction, although usually there is some sort of fee for, let's say, a bank or a credit card company to make that transaction into the other currency. When you take all of that into consideration, then you have the host country currency. So that's the way that those transactions work. I do a lot of traveling, and when I'm abroad, I have a credit card that I use. And the credit card that I have doesn't have a transaction fee, and that's really important, especially if you're an international student. So if you don't know whether or not, let's say you have a credit card or a debit card and you don't know, make sure to call them, find out how they make those, how they determine what their exchange rate is, and if there's any fees involved. Then you can compare them to see what's the best rate for you. Now again, there's a lot of places that you can make that transaction, and it just depends on what's more convenient for you. You can take your US dollars or let's say another currency and basically exchange it into another currency. It could be a bank, it could even be at some hotels they do that. There's kiosks that do that. that. There's credit card companies, so there's a number of different places where you can do that transaction. So with that being said, well, what does that mean for you? How can you really make your currency go the farthest it can? So there's 4 steps to do that I recommend to make sure that your money goes the farthest. The first step is that you make sure that you know what your exchange rate is and any fees. So like I mentioned, there's credit card companies out there that don't have transaction fees, so it's important to be aware of that. Usually if you're going to go to a bank or another institution, they're going to have a fee associated with it. So before you do any sort of transaction, find out what it is. The other thing to keep in mind as well when you're talking about transaction fees and currency exchanges, as I mentioned, it's constantly changing day to day to day, hour to hour. So contact your bank, contact your credit card company, or anyone else to find out what that amount is, how much you're going to pay. Sometimes the fee is actually included in the percentage that they give you for the exchange rate. So you'll also kind of want to dive into those numbers and see what they reveal. The second thing you're going to want to know is to regularly check the exchange rate, because in the end, how do you know whether or not it's a good amount? So what I recommend doing, I personally like Yahoo Finance, but you can use any one you want, and you can look over different periods of time. So what I would recommend, start with a week, and then you can also extend that out to a couple months, a couple of years to see the overall trend. And obviously if you see that your currency is devaluing, or in other words, it's buying less of your host country currency, then you're going to want to make any big transactions right away. And it's almost like a little game, because you have to figure out where you predict that exchange rate to go, and so that way you can make the most of it. But if you don't want to predict and you want to be certain, the next step, that brings me to step number 3, is to set notifications. There are a lot of tools online to help you manage your exchange rate. And one tool that I personally like is one that actually notifies you when your rate becomes a certain amount. And you can set that target to whatever you want. So that way you get a notification about what your exchange rate is, that it's favorable, and then that's the time that you can take your currency and turn that into the other currency that you're in. Or you can make your purchases using your credit card or your debit card, however you find is easiest, depending on what your host country is. And the last step is purchase when it's a favorable rate. When it turns to be a favorable rate, that's when you want to make the large purchases. Exchange rates, again, if you're doing a couple dollar changes, it's not going to impact the amount that you pay. Although it is important to keep in mind, though, that your fee will probably be a bigger percentage of your overall total. So with that in mind, these are some tips that we wanted to share with you to make sure that as you budget, you take these 2 considerations, so that way you're able to make the most of your money and make sure that it goes farther. So with that, that concludes our presentation. I'm going to answer all of your questions live online, so please send in your questions. Again, on the corner of our Google Hangout, you can put your questions there, and then I'll be answering your questions today on Facebook and Twitter as well as Google+. So please send them in. We do not have any questions yet, so I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds here and see if anyone has any questions, and make sure that you all understand how financing works. If you have any questions about loans, you can send those in as well. Okay, well, it looks like we have a good overview, no questions. As I mentioned, we'll be available the rest of the day for any of your exchange rate questions, so send those in to us. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on our Google Hangout.